As a substance use evaluator, you act as an investigator, a translator, and a guide for individuals at critical crossroads in their lives. You are building a clinical narrative, a structured synthesis of a client's history, used to secure the specific level of care they need. To build a defensible evaluation, we follow 4 distinct milestones: selecting screening tools, conducting a comprehensive interview, formulating a diagnosis, and organizing the final written report. The document you produce is legally and clinically binding. It dictates whether a client receives life-saving care or falls through the cracks of the justice system. Step 1 begins before the client ever sits down, selecting a standardized preliminary screening questionnaire tailored to their primary issue. You have a few baseline options. If the referral concerns alcohol, you deploy the audit or the MAST. For concerns regarding other drugs, you use the DAST. However, when evaluating court-mandated clients, you will often encounter individuals who are defensive, in denial, or motivated to hide their usage. This comparison highlights why we introduce the SASE-4. While the audit and DAST ask direct questions, the SASE-4 is designed for deceptive environments, testing subtle personality and attitude markers to identify hidden substance abuse. Remember, these screening questionnaires are strictly preliminary indicators, not a final diagnosis. These results serve as a clinical compass, identifying the specific red flags you will investigate during the face-to-face interview. Step 2 is the clinical interview. Before asking a single question, establish a quiet, private, and distraction-free environment to build immediate trust. This 3-legged stool diagram represents the biopsychosocial model, the foundational architecture of your entire assessment. The first leg is the biological pillar. Here, you document physical health decline, specific withdrawal symptoms, and family genetic history. The second leg is the psychological pillar. You probe for co-occurring mental health conditions, trauma history, and the client's baseline coping skills. The third leg is the social pillar. This requires you to uncover environmental factors, focusing on legal history like DUIs, housing stability, and peer support networks. A common mistake is using the interview to ask a client how much they consume. Instead, focus on how that consumption alters these 3 pillars of their life. If you assess the substance but ignore the physical body, the mind, and the environment, the resulting treatment plan will fail. Step 3 transitions your workflow from data gathering to clinical formulation using the DSM-5-TR manual. This gauge illustrates the diagnostic rule. Severity is determined exclusively by counting how many of the 11 criteria the client meets. 2 to 3 checks is mild, 4 to 5 is moderate, and 6 or more is severe. If a client uses multiple substances, apply the polysubstance rule. You assess, diagnose, and score each substance completely independently. Once the diagnosis is established, applying the ASAM criteria is your mandatory next step. The ASAM criteria maps the severity of the diagnosis to the intensity of care required, ranging from basic outpatient counseling to intensive residential treatment. Strict criteria counting prevents both the underprescribing and overprescribing of treatment. This ensures the court mandates an intervention that matches the client's true risk level. Step 4 is the final production phase. You synthesize your interview notes, test scores, and clinical formulations into a standardized case presentation format. This digital document outlines the headers that courts and insurance companies expect. You start with identifying information, presenting problem, substance use history, and biopsychosocial history. Next, you include the final clinical headers: screening tool results, DSM-5-TR diagnosis, and ASAM dimensions and recommendations. Under your diagnosis section, the text must be explicitly written out. For instance, primary diagnosis, F11.20, opioid use disorder, severe, meeting 8 of 11 criteria. Clinical insights are only useful if they are accessible. A rigid structural template is what makes your professional judgment legally and medically defensible. You now have the workflow to select screening tools, map a client's biopsychosocial life, formulate a diagnosis, and structure the final report. As you begin this work, remember your ultimate ethical guardrail. Your clinical recommendations must be based entirely on the gathered evidence, insulated from external pressures. To see how these frameworks translate to real-world writing, Study the fully worked sample evaluations provided in Chapter 10 of your manual. By adhering to these standards, you ensure that your evaluations serve as a reliable, objective bridge between a client's crisis and their recovery.